So I was asked to come here, well, to be there, but then we decided we would just virtual it. So I got basically 5 hours at least back of my time. And hopefully some other people did as well. Although it's really good to also meet in person. So that way I can put faces to names and also because I like to be a little bit more interactive as well. So we'll just see how this goes. So today's topics based on like the poster as presented is repatriation, Saskatchewan law, UNDRIP, and then truth-telling Indigenous laws and collaboration. Now, the truth-telling Indigenous laws and collaboration will be weaved throughout in order to provide some context and bring some examples forward of how they are used within like legislation, implementation, enactment, enforcement, as well as just thinking and moving forward with repatriation. And people can stop me if you have any questions, okay? So I know we already did a little bit of an introduction, but I'm always like who I am and why repatriation, because a lot of people are like, who are you to say anything, right? Because I'm not a knowledge keeper, I'm not a language keeper. Um, and I didn't uh grow up on the res or even within my nation because I was adopted out during that wonderful 60s scoops time. I call it a BOGO because my mom went into foster care right from the hospital and then she had me. So then I went into foster care from like in the womb. So it's like a BOGO, buy one, get one, right? They made career. So where are you from? I'm from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation. As I stated before, uh, I I am though an active member of our nation now. I don't know how many times I get shoulder tapped, and it's not for chip-ins. It's literally, hi, can you be on this selection committee, or can you please review um, this brief or something like that? So I am definitely a committed member of my nation. And for those that are wondering about the Lavallee last name, if you're like Muskeg doesn't sound like a Lavallee name, isn't that Pie Pod or Cowessess? Trust me, when Chief Cadmus was part of Cowessess, he was always asking me, "Are you sure you're not from Mars?" I'm like, "No, I'm from Muskeg." So, but so I'm part of the Venn and the LaFond type of families up there. So my mother was a Venn and my grandmother was a Venn. And that's how you got a Dr. Jaime Lavallee in a Muskeg Lake Cree. Another aspect that I do is Indigenous nation building, and you may wonder why this is up here at this moment. It's up here because when I went back for my doctorate, I had already worked for a number of years in the repatriation and cultural rights field in the US. And I wanted to see how or why a lot of the nations that I felt were, you know, leaders in cultural reclamation and revitalization and maintenance. Um, why there were some that were and there were some that were still struggling. Now, it's not all subsumed necessarily within what people might think, but the Indigenous nation building aspect is something I went to learn and to apply. And I believe it's important because we just, like one of the things that I stress when I'm working within communities or nations, even organizations, is that uh, the the ability and the decision to make it your own is really important, right? If even if you take the exact same things, um, you need to be able to have it explained for why. You have it where you're going, how you're going to do it, when, and like who. So if those aren't thought of, even if you decide to take the exact same like traffic law or something like that, if those aren't at least thought of, and then and then the policy or law is enacted from it, then yeah, I like to say it's just basically just another neo-colonialism type of thing. And I believe that repatriation and rematriation, this area, is can be fundamental to bringing that that strength back to the communities of decisions and responsibilities and obligations, because these are ancestors and belongings that we still care about. And I think it's important to show the current generations that it doesn't matter where you are or what you did or whatever, we still care about ourselves. We still care about ancestors, and one day we will be an ancestor too. So therefore, descendants have responsibilities as well. So I worked for a number of years in the US, which sometimes means that people are like, "Why are you so American?" But for good or for not so good, um, I do have sometimes that mindset of why not just do it, right? Like, which dovetails nicely with the Indigenous Nation-building theory that I do, because that's what it is. Just it's almost like just do it. They call themselves the Nike Nations, right? Um, because they're not waiting around for permission from external governments to make decisions about where they want to go, who's going to be their citizens, what land they consider theirs. So I thought I'd just put that out there that this is part of it, as well as the fact that the Department of the Interior in the US is where the National NAGPRA program is. And for those that don't know NAGPRA, it's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that was uh, put into law in November 16th, 1990 in the US in order for um, tribal nations to have a process to um, like start looking and finding their ancestors and deciding whether or not they um, want them back, and as well as putting together a process of how that happens. Okay, so with that, there is, um, you know, there's pros and cons to having national legislation. There's pros and cons to having a uniform type of process, which are which could be an entirely different, 2 days instead of just the hour and a half that we have here. However, if people have a question about that aspect, then please let me know. If not, then we can keep going forward. The history of how NAGPRA and the Native American uh, the National Museum of the American Indian Act came about. Uh, there are a few books out there that can definitely tell you. Dr. Tim McEwen is one person that I usually direct people to, because he put down a really good history of just all the bills that had to go on, and the collaboration that actually had to go on in the House and in the Senate, which would be, I think, difficult to do now in that country down south. So, so for today, we're going to talk about repatriation in general. So, oops, backspace. Oops. So this is where my interaction type of goes sometimes is um, what and why repatriation or rematriation? Like, does anyone have an understanding of what that is that they would like to share? You could put it in the chat and hopefully somebody would read it for me. Oh, Gabrielle?
Sure, yeah, I'll just say uh, returning control and authority of ancestral remains and belongings to descendants.
Okay. Anybody else? Hmm, that's a good one, right? So, oh wow, yes, to return something. That's the repat and the rematriation aspect. Um, Typically, when you hear about a repatriation, it is about returning something to the country. Sometimes it's actually when you hear somebody say they're an expat, that means that they're not living in that country. They're not living in their home country. They are living in a different country. So then you get repatriated back, and then you're just not an expat of that of any place else. For a lot of museums, right, this repatriation, rematriation aspect is the return of actually of human remains or ancestral ancestors and cultural objects, cultural items, belongings to Indigenous communities. And I've put the repatriation and the rematriation together because there is more movement nowadays towards rematriation to highlight a number of factors. One, repatriation, if you look at the word, the patriation, anybody hear of the patriarchy? Um, those are like the root words, right? So that means basically the repatriation has a very masculine context, and it is also one, as we've seen, that is used broader and farther away with not just about Indigenous ancestors and the the history of removals. Instead, rematriation can help also put an emphasis on the the matrilineal. So the idea that many nations were matrilineal, and or even if they weren't, the disenfranchisement, right? The taking away of an identity through the Indian Act has caused a lot of turmoil within nations and generations. So this is also a reemphasis of the importance of women in maintaining a community and having that culture. And then rematriation is also an aspect of returning back to the Mother Earth, especially for those ancestors or belongings that do need to, return. So if my thing is that if nations don't think about their own definitions, own ideas and values about what they want to get and to share it broadly enough, then the external people who are not understanding of your own culture and knowledge will make those definitions for you. And I know that since the Indian Act rules me womb to tomb, right, cradle to grave, um, I try to put as many definitions of my own in my own life and to make those own decisions. And I know I try and support my nation and other nations as well with um, parsing out what do they mean when they are looking at like belongings? What do they mean when they want a return, like a repatriation or a rematriation? What does that mean? And having them make those decisions about what it encompasses is helpful with either pushing back against someone else's external thing, or maybe even replacing it in its entirety with your own definition, which would then be able to adequately reflect your culture and be far more culturally appropriate. Now, with the tangible aspects, we see property, but even even some of the things that we think of as tangible are also considered to a certain extent intangible or not objects that a museum would typically think of as belongings. And one of the things I'm thinking about right here, as we said, as you see in the intangible one, is archaeological sketches of the removal. Photos. Right now, there's a push at the Pitt Museum to possibly return um, or repatriate photo negatives that have been in their possession that were taken of people a long, long time ago. So, like, how and what will depend. And I know that when I was working in the US, um, some holding institutions, which is what I'm going to try and call them, holding institutions, because uh, it's not just museums that hold our ancestors and belongings. Um, it's definitely universities, right? But it can also be agencies as well, or even like visitor centers, or you will be surprised where and who and when they were holding. So with the holding institutions, some holding institutions actually um, did uh, believe and therefore encompassed in their definition of associated funerary objects or funerary objects, the soil that was removed at the time that people were unburied, right? And they would return those with the ancestors. Other holding institutions said that those are not part of a funerary object because it's just dirt. Um, so therefore they don't return it. But then you're like, well, if it's just dirt, why not return it? Hmm. So that's, there's a little bit of obfuscation going on there, right? Like it's like, if it's just dirt, then why don't you return it? But then why would you have kept it? And what are you doing with it then, right? I'm gonna stop at that one because like I said, there's so many different ways that people have interpreted things, and it's really important, I think, for nations to be able to come back with their own ideas and definitions. The stronger, the better, right? So, why repatriation and rematriation? Because there were removals. Some from like some people may know of as like ground disturbing activities, right? When they're putting up a bridge or creating something, right? Like building something. However, removals could have also have occurred um, for a variety of reasons. There were a lot of people, at least in the US, that's not as well documented up here, that did a lot of actual just grave robbing, right? It's a there's a diary entry and some historical records that show that 3 days after um, the pilgrims came, they started looking at our stuff, started looking in the ossuaries, the funerary belongings, and taking them because they thought it looked cool. I know that for myself, I always ask people, if you were going to a cemetery, would you just go, oh, free flowers, and then take them home and give them to your loved one? Or, and I know that I've seen this one too, um, going by a child's grave and seeing like a Hot Wheels car. That is not freezy, that's not free for the taking. Those are our objects that are put there. Now, um, when these removals happened, it wasn't just flowers and Hot Wheels cars, right? It was a lot more. And one of the reasons that contributed to the creation of the federal legislation in the US was people realizing that the unequal treatment of removals. So they would, if they were going to build something and there was an Anglican cemetery and then an Indian cemetery, right? They would ask the Anglican church for permission, and then they would take them and they would probably rebury them near a current day congregation. But for the indigenous ones, for the Indian cemeteries and all that stuff, they wouldn't. They would just take them and then they would put them into education, or sometimes they would grind them back up to put them into like the gravel because they would help make roads and stuff like that. Or people just took pieces home as like souvenirs for what they worked on. That so uh, thankfully that doesn't happen as much now. Hopefully it doesn't happen at all, but I can't vouch for that. Uh, Also, we do the repatriation and rematriation for unification, right? To make things whole as we can again. Um, and then that can also spark out the revitalization, right? Bringing the community together to show what descendant responsibilities are for ancestors. And it can also, once reunified, right, it can also revitalize certain ceremonies that may not have been able to be done because that belonging was taken. Okay? And the idea with this is that for some tribes, I would probably say many, there are differences in what are animate and inanimate between their indigenous like worldview and what would be the Western legal systems worldview of what is animate and inanimate. And one of the biggest examples I usually use is the idea that in the Northwest there was a rock that had a being carved on it, and for the nations that were affiliated with that, they saw it as an actual representation of a human being, the one that helped create them. But underneath Western law, that's not human remains, right? It's a rock. And then they were like, well, it's also now a cultural object. Okay, so we can get it back through there, or do we need to ask for it as human remains, right? So those types of questions are going to hopefully be ones that nations will need to think about. And and that goes back to the responsibilities and Indigenous-led decisions, right? That is what I stress all the time. I'm like, if somebody wants to wants to pave over maybe a ceremonial site, for whatever reason, so long as they are fully informed and they have ongoing consent from their people and they know what that's going to mean, then I'll, then as a technician, I will try and help you get to that point, because it's not about just being like in the past or doing that other stuff. It's about what type of decisions are you going to have, and being fully informed and aware enough to make those decisions, whether they are seen as beneficial or maybe not so beneficial, or if they have short-term versus long-term, right? It's all about Indigenous led decisions. Um, and we are here because, as I said, even a couple days after the Pilgrims came, they started collecting. Like, we were considered curio collecting. So if anybody's ever heard of a curio cabinet, right? That's basically some places where our ancestors' remains were showcased and in people's houses, right? I knew of a person who was about 28 years old, so they're about 30 right now. They live in they lived in what is it? Idaho. And they bought Native American human remains at a garage sale sometime in the last like 10 years, right? Because they're curios to some people still, and not actual like respect for the fact that they are human remains. Um, they have avocational archaeology. So avocational is just a really fancy word for amateur. Okay, so amateur archaeology. A lot of people went out and in the beginning started just digging through stuff because they were, you know, then we go back down to the Vanishing Indian at the bottom of this one, right? It was this idea that they have usurped the indigenous peoples that are on that land. So anything that's left in that land, they get to control. So Thomas Jefferson started digging in his backyard because he was like, "Oh, look at all this! Look, there's this big, funerary mound. I'm gonna dig in it and learn more, and gather and collect because I find it neat and interesting." We went down to biblical justifications, the manifest destiny aspect, being that the gods gold and glory, the guns, germs, and steel, whichever ones you guys want. But the biblical justification and the scientific racism kind of go hand in hand with each other. And they go as well to the idea that um, up in Canada, right, at the same time as they were taking children, they were also taking belongings, right? Ceremonial objects for a multitude of reasons. One, well, if they did their job right, the children wouldn't be using ceremonial objects that were, Indian. They would instead be whatever Christian denomination of the residential school that they attended. Um, and it also was a way in which to, um, destroy the culture as it stood as well. So that that type of takings of belongings was meant to preserve this vanishing culture for future generations to look back on and see, the stoic Indian or the warlike Indian or whatever type of narrative they wanted to create. So there are a lot of belongings that may be in holding institutions that people haven't seen in a long time. And with the scientific racism, this idea being that, I was like, I don't know how scientific it was as compared to nowadays. One of my favorite things is to let people know that they decided that the Caucasian skull was the most beautiful one out of all of them because it fit the most BB pellets, right? That's how they started measuring the capacity for brain power and beauty was to take skulls and look at them and decide, right, based on that. But that also helped two things. One, it helped the the um, the nation states to um, disregard the rights that Indigenous peoples had to the lands, which meant that they could disregard um, the responsibilities of the nations with keeping their ancestors where they were, right? And then it also helped with slavery because then they could also justify slavery at the same time. So a lot of this was just about trying to like like embed race as a concept to be able to take and to have property. So either property as a human being underneath slavery or property as in, getting rid of the indigenous peoples on the land and taking that property front and center. So anybody have any questions so far? Yeah, was this all just laying on you kind of heavy? Okay. So again, we got repatriation that we were talking about, like the reason why we have it, what it might mean. And now we're going to look at the Saskatchewan law and UNDRIP. So the the collecting of ancestors and belongings happened a lot earlier than 1989, but I wanted to show that 1989 is when Canada undertook to start thinking about this, right? So they started thinking about it, and then in 92 they issued a report, and they thought that in Canada, um, holding institutions and Indigenous nations would get along well enough that they would just start doing it. So that's why they didn't need to have a federal law like they did in the US 2 years earlier. Now, I can say that that optimism is not yet in play. Okay. So 20 some, actually, is it like 30 some years later? Uh, just waiting for returns isn't necessarily happening. So we have UNDRIP come into the U.S. and Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, the Kanzu states, um, in about 2010, and then 11 years later, we see UNDRIPA come in. So um, with UNDRIPA coming in 2021. 6 years before that, of course, we have the TRC, calls to actions for the museums and archives. And if you look, there are a number of calls to actions between six, their number like 67 to 70. Okay, and some of them do talk about the about repatriation and other aspects. Um, but it's also calling on them to, collaborate and consult and and it's like it's a good place for call to action to get people started, but it didn't mandate anything regards to repatriations or rematriations. Okay. So the UNDRIP articles that pertain to repatriation are 11, 12, 13, 15, and 31 of UNDRIP, right? And a lot of people look towards the declaration to ground their claims and to ground themselves in showing that it's not just me, right? It's international like norms that are coming out now. And it's become a national norm, allegedly, with the implementation of UNDRIPA. Okay. But there has not yet been a lot of movement nationally for this. And that I think is something that might start changing soon as more and more people are understanding that we don't have some of the items that we need. We don't have some of the items that we would like back, and we don't have our ancestors that we need to take care of in their lands. And one of the things that nations need to talk about and make decisions about is whether or not they will get the physical, like physically get their ancestors, and then if they want to rebury them. Now, I don't know about you guys, but my nation didn't go around having reburial ceremonies. We had burial stuff, right? We had like funerary ceremonies. Like you, when somebody was, you know, part of that like has died, and you do those rites and those ceremonies, we weren't looking to go back out and dig them up and then move them someplace else. So I know for a lot of the tribes in the tribal nations in the US, they had to think about what type of reburial ceremonies they might have um, if they wanted to rebury, right? As well as even if they did want to rebury, um, are the um, like actual remains contaminated? Because a lot of times biological items would get DDT and arsenic and other stuff put on them in order for them to retain their biological nature. So it's almost like if you go into a museum or collections part of stuff and you see something and it's like 100 some years old and it looks almost brand new, I would say make sure you wear gloves and get it tested. And that alone can be quite costly. I know that in the US, in the early years of the repatriation, The records weren't that great sometimes. And now it's actually mandated that they have to release the records and they have to show if they have any knowledge of whether or not it's been contaminated, because a lot of people got sick because they were starting to actually utilize those ceremonial objects, right, within their dances, and to store them with food because that, like for their feasts and stuff like that. And people were getting sick. So that's something also to think about. Um, I went to the McCord Museum like a few years ago with a student who was looking into repatriation, and they were like, "Oh," and they went to go touch it, and I was like, "No, no, no, gloves." And I'm like, "I'm not telling you gloves because, we're a museum and we have to look all fancy and touch things." And I'm like, "Gloves because you don't know if it's contaminated or not, and you do not want to hurt yourself." So. I know he was like, "Oh, thanks." Of course, he went and he smelled it, and I was like, "Okay, you also know that you could be inhaling some contaminants, but you know, at least you didn't touch it." Baby steps. So in Saskatchewan, I don't know if anybody knows this or not, but there is no provincial legislation that mandates back that return or that repatriation, right? The Royal Saskatchewan Museum has a policy, and they created it a long time ago, and they based it basically on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, because that's that's the example that was around, right? They had did some modifications on it, but the RSM has one. So the Royal Saskatchewan Museum has one. Um, and then the Museums Association of Saskatchewan encourages this, right, to help with museums doing their consultation, right? And to repair relationships from taking, right, dispossessing people. And with that, and hopefully they said that it would hopefully initiate and lead to an actual repatriation. Again, that decision is the nation's to make. And I say this because there are some tribes that have said they could create a reburial ceremony. However, as of right now, they find it culturally inappropriate to do so. So they will not take their people physically back. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't take them legally back and care for them, and put in, stipulations and conditions of the holding institution for what to do and what not to do. But it doesn't mean that they are going to do that. And then there are other tribal nations, other indigenous nations, that is their push, right? Native Hawaiians through the Hui Malama organization, they scoured um, not just the US, but globally. The Haida as well have their main priority to be the return of ancestors, right? Other ones may want to have the return of belongings first, or certain types of belongings, right? Because maybe they need those in order to create some of the ceremonies to find out how to do the reburials and what type of priorities they need, right? I am not prescriptive on that. I think it's about what is the nation and their citizens' wish, desire, responsibilities, priority, first and foremost. And even if it is the not right now, then that's fine too, right? It's, but it's giving them the decision to say not right now, rather than not letting them know that they actually have items and ancestors out there. So, so what are the limitations, barriers, and things like that for repatriation? I think nobody would be surprised with the idea of funding. It actually is pretty expensive sometimes to repatriate, and it's not just the re physical returning. The funding is also about research, right? So many tribal nations had to do a lot of their own research in order to almost like I've seen them basically give packages almost to holding institutions that say, here you go. Here are all the states and the counties and the ages that we were living where you took stuff. So you as a museum are now on notice that we want all of those things, right? That takes a while. Um, it can also take a while to find these holding institutions. So that takes time and money. And then consulting, right? We have Zoom now, so sometimes you can, um, do uh, less travel. However, there is still times when you do need to travel, right? And there are some items that may or may not be able to be video recorded or photographed, right? So, or there are people that need to actually like lay hands on something to find out whether or not it is whether or not it is theirs, whether or not it is culturally affiliated with them. Um, Policies, right? There are so just because the law says return it doesn't mean that a holding institution can't put in policies to help facilitate it, which may not actually feel like it's being facilitated. Right? I had a few um, tribal nations call me up and say, well, this museum wants to know about X, Y, and Z ceremony in order to give it back, but we can't do that, right? And they wanted it in writing, and I was like, well, take a, take a note from them and redact it. So sometimes they got whole pages full of redacted. So I don't know if do people know what redacted means? And have you guys ever seen a redacted um file? Gabriel has, Melanie's
Just all
never.
blacked out.
Yeah, it's basically all like blacked out and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, here you go. Now you can feel better that you have this piece or pieces of paper. And now you just have to believe us that this is actually a belonging of ours and it's a belonging that's needed for the ceremony. Right. I also recommend that maybe they also uh, enact their own freedom of information. So that way they can actually point it to holding institutions and say, oh, we're sorry, but underneath our Freedom of Information Act, that is actually private for the next um, next 1,000 years. So we're not going to share it with you. That's one of the things I think that's important too. The people, right? Sometimes you have people that are great to work with, and sometimes you might not. Uh, Capacity is it's it's like sometimes it feels like the more you do well, the more you get work from. And at a certain point, though, your cup might flow over. So it's also about capacity. It's also about when I say about capacity as well, it's also the burnout factor too, because I know for a lot of people that work in the repatriation field down in the US, especially the tribal nations, they they say that the ancestors come and disrupt their dreams and tell them that they need to hurry up. Right? And it can also just be hard. I know that uh, a former NAGPRA representative wrote about how hard it was for him whenever he had to um, get children's skulls back and how he felt when he reburied them, right? So there are very real capacity issues, not just there, but capacity emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And then, of course, sometimes those manifest into physical um, incapacities. So there's that aspect.
We have a question about a barrier, and
Okay, yep.
when When you say legally back, does that mean the nations have to go through some type of court or government process and bear the cost of that?
No, actually, when I say legally back, I mean that the ownership aspect, because that's unfortunately that's what it's called, right? They own the ancestors and belongings as property. Okay. Um, so sometimes people will get something back legally, so that means that they have control over them. And they are the ones that would need to make the decisions. So the museums or the holding institutions would have to talk to the nation about what they would do or not do. Sometimes it means that they get put into a different, let's say, a different type of room that can actually, that's separate from the museum's broader collections because it needs to be stored with tobacco or something else. And, underneath museum guidelines, the tobacco would not be allowed in their collections because museums have very specific types of practices for how to keep things in like a safe and correct manner, including, what temperatures are the best, right? So that's what I mean. When I say legally, it just basically means that you get control over it, but it's not necessarily that you have physical control over it. Okay. Does that make sense, Crystal?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. But there have been people that have went to court to get certain items back too. Right? If anybody saw the Gennewick man, that big huge debate from like 95 or 96 until like a few years ago, that was a huge court battle. I'm always surprised though that at the first instant they're like, this guy looks like Jean-Luc Picard, so of course he's gotta like he's not an Indian, so he couldn't have been there that long ago, right? So it was like, okay, so tens of thousands of years ago there was a white guy that looked like Jean-Luc Picard, just happened to be there, so you guys are now claiming that individual, and so what, all that land too? That doesn't make any sense to me, right?
And
Later
even
they started, yeah, they
the
started doing the different cranials. Yeah.
yeah.
And then they were like, oh, maybe it doesn't look like Jean-Luc Picard. And then, well, maybe it actually is culturally like affiliated to the tribal nations that have been there for tens of thousands of years, right? But that is an entirely separate thing, and there are tons of books and magazine and articles on the Gennewick man.
Can I
So,
just like throw
yeah.
one thing in here? So like a big part of this, so like during like the early colonial period, there was this when you're talking about like the biblical basis, there was this idea that like indigenous people were the lost tribes of Israel, right? And you see this even like ossified and calcified in Mormon doctrine. But
Hmm.
so much of like the early sort of archaeological work and this baggage we're still trying to get over is they're still trying to find weird evidence of this, right? So yeah, it's just it's such a weird mess.
Hmm. And then, but being the lost tribe of that, right, is also that there's still a hierarchy in there, if I remember correctly, because there's the Hamitites and all these other things, and those people were darker and that, and it's like I don't go very much into that, but yeah, that's also part of that biblical justification. It was also though like if you look at some of the archaeological works that were being done in the southeast with those huge burial mounds and cities and things like that, where the archaeologists came back and were like, oh yeah, no, the people that built these were super smart and advanced and they did so much stuff. So they somehow went 100% extinct in like some timeline that we don't even know, and we can't find those bodies for the extinction because they are definitely 100% not like the ancestors of those that live here right now because they don't live in those cities and they aren't as advanced, obviously, because they have certain ideas of what advancement is, and right, so they have since been proven incorrect. However, it's still getting past that. And a lot of times, sometimes holding institutions haven't really reviewed a lot of their records. And sometimes they're still holding things that are misidentified or that are being held in like underneath racist types of ideas of who it was or what it is. Okay. So this question of like how will it go about? That is something that a nation really does need to talk to themselves with, right? And that could mean entire citizens, it could mean smaller groups, it could mean knowledge keepers, it could mean shaking tent. I'm not sure, right? I don't prescribe that type of aspect. All I do know, though, is that the nation will need to decide, right, what type of law and policies they want, what their priorities are, what type of infrastructure there is. And when I say infrastructure, I don't just mean like the personnel and stuff like that. I also mean like zoning too. Like if you're going to repatriate you want and rebury, you need to make sure you find a place that is secure and that you've tested the thing, the remains, and there's not no contamination. But it's also a good idea just to, you know, hedge your bets a bit and make sure you're not burying them on top of an aquifer. So there's a lot of different types of things that may need to go about. And even with the infrastructure, when I'm talking about that too, I know with the Haida, they actually made it as part of their revitalization too, to have people create the cedar boxes for the burials, right? So they put that into play in like the schools and things like that. So that way, it's not just learning in abstract, right? It's actually doing. It's actually it's actually like undertaking those responsibilities and those creating and telling why. So that way people will understand. So, does anybody else have any questions so far? No? Okay. So with the process of repatriation, it's like I said, it's gonna be different for the holding institutions, Indigenous communities, right? Even if it's nationally done, there are so many different ways that people go through it. One of the things I try to explain to people is that uh, you know, Saskatchewan has a Municipalities Act. However, Saskatoon and Regina definitely operate differently, even though they're big cities, right? And North Battleford and Prince Albert operate differently. So even if you have a national or provincial one, people will implement it in different ways. Some of that will be good because there'll be some flexibilities, and they won't be maybe as rigid. But then sometimes that's not good because they could be rigid about their definitions and they could be saying, no, this is the only way that you can go about doing this because this is the way that we interpret the legislation and our policies. Okay. And it's whether or not you have the capability and wish to push back on those. Again, it's like somebody, again, Little Traverse Bay Band made quite a few claims for ceremonial bowls. And some of the holding institutions came back and said, bowls aren't sacred. They're like, pipes are sacred, and this type of thing is sacred, and that type of thing is sacred. And they're like, and we know this because we've worked with the Cree and the other people, right? And then the Dawa have to come back and say, well, that's very nice for them. But you wouldn't have this bowl in your collection unless it was a ceremonial bowl. We can tell by the cuttings inside that this was used as a ceremonial bowl. And we're going to just pretend that the Dawa say, oh, and we love the Cree. However, we are not Cree. So you can give those pipes to the Crees, but we want our bowls, right? So, unfortunately, it is also sometimes re-educating people. or educating them in ways to show that, like, because the idea is that we're not all just one type of Indigenous person, and we all don't have, feather dresses, or we all don't do pipes, or we don't all do jingles, right? So that's that idea, is that there will be some stereotypes that would need to be, um, you know, I've hopefully destroyed. And the people then would be able to, um, hopefully then the holding institutions would be able to understand the actual diversity of the Indigenous nations. So, anybody else have any other questions? No. So the next steps, but the next steps is, well, first of all, was all the stuff I talked about earlier, which was to have the nation make that decision about whether or not they want to go forward in this area, and to talk with their the people that would be able to help them make that decision and to make those priorities, and then to start building your claims and your cases. Um, However, if you don't know what's out there, you don't know what could be coming back. So I also suggest to people, um, even like parallel to talking with your nation, is to find out where and what was taken. Okay. I tried to do that a couple of years ago for a grant that I had, but I was told that that's too vulnerable of a topic, and I have to go through full ethics review to ask public holding institutions if they have Indigenous remains, where where they were taken, how many, and who they believe were affiliated to them. That's too sensitive. So if anybody wants to look into that, you either have to do it outside of, like, don't get any university money type of thing, or get the SHIRK grant or whatever, and then um, go through the ethics process, so that way you can find out who has your ancestors, because you have to do the entire ethics thing because Indigenous peoples are vulnerable. Okay. Now, you guys might hear a little edge on that. That's because I just really am upset about that stuff. There's one thing about having ethics oversight to make sure people aren't being exploited. It's an entirely different aspect when they tell me what's good for me, right? And my not favorite phrase is, well, we wouldn't do that if you weren't Indigenous. So So find out where and what was taken. That is very important. Some of that will be found through, like I said, talking to holding institutions. However, it can also be found sometimes by talking with elders, or people that have histories within your lands, right? Because sometimes people came in and they were all friends and buddies, and then when they left, you realized, oh, they have our stuff and we don't know where it went. Right? Hudson Bay Company was big on that. I think there's been a lot of news out there about the Vatican having items, right? And whether or not they are going to return and what types of repatriations they're going to do. So, as well as how it was taken. So a lot of times, if someone was allowed to give it to somebody, free and clear, no conditions or whatever, then that holding institution probably has the right to keep it if they want to. However, if it was taken from duress or by somebody who wasn't, like, legally allowed to do so, and I mean legally allowed to do so within Indigenous laws, right? So sometimes what has happened is that the wife of a knowledge keeper would give those items to somebody else and sell them. However, underneath Indigenous law, the wife doesn't get that, right? It's the next one in line for the knowledge keeping that might. So that might be a nephew. It might be like somebody else that actually has that legal, like, right underneath Indigenous laws. to possess it and to use it. And even though the Western law has like, the right of inheritance with regards to like the living spouse, underneath Indigenous law, which hasn't been usurped over all of that stuff, it should be legally underneath somebody else's care. So, um, do we want a Canadian national law? I don't know. How about an Indigenous-led national law? Would that be helpful? I'm not sure. Um, this is the one I like the best, which is just we create our own legislation and then just start telling the museums this is what we find important. This is what you have that fits our definitions. And you know, by the way, can we do this can we do this before Treaty Day because we want to have a ceremony for them? Right. So I'm a big proponent of that, but that's only because of that whole Indigenous nation building. And I really feel that since a lot of the holding institutions are enacted underneath provincial laws, like universities, colleges, museums, and things like that, which puts like the property and civil rights stuff into Section 91 of the Constitution provincially, right? Or no, it's 91/24 is federal, and 92 is the provincial aspects. We also see that the Indian Act sometimes isn't totally gross. But Section 88 of the Indian Act says that, right? But for federal legislation, uh, you know, uh, 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 provincial laws of general application apply, right? Or a treaty or some other aspect, right? So for me, my idea is that if a nation enacted this, then that puts it at the very least on a federal type of level, which would show also that it affects the core of Indianness. So therefore, the provincial legislation that tells me that they own my ancestors isn't valid anymore. Okay. Um, is there going to be a nation that will take that leap? Perhaps. Will it be a difficult road? Maybe, right? But I wanted to make sure that people know that that's one way as well. And it's not just relying on the provincial or the federal governments. Um, and the other part is we have to continue, I think, to collect the wise practices of others, right? What have they done? What haven't they done? What have they learned? Right? Like I said, with those like booklets almost of like research, a lot of the nations learned that they had to give that to the museums, even if they were, experts at experts at being standing buffalo cultural historians, right? It's like maybe, but this is also the standing buffalo historical aspects that we find really important. And if it flies in the face of what you guys learned, then you just need to relearn this in the proper way. And that will be, of course, locally, nationally, and internationally, because um, there are ancestors and belongings out there that aren't just around us, aren't just in Canada, but have been taken and are somewhere around in this world, in this globe, right? Just like they did for the adopt an Indian or adopt a Métis child, right? Our children, our ancestors, and our belongings were taken and placed in areas that we don't know where, except for the fact that we know that we're missing. So,
I watched your webinar from earlier in the year and I thought it was really.
pardon?
I said I watched your webinar earlier in the year and just after watching it, I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw a group of Easter Islanders at a London institute singing to one of their ancestors that was taken by that facility. And they were singing to what looked like a stone, but to them it was an ancestor. And so I thought it was really interesting. Is there is repatriation happening in other Indigenous communities across the world? Or is it just us that's behind, or are we all kind of at the same pace of bringing things home?
I would say that the the tribal nations that are within the US are farther along than any other place, and that's because of the legislation that's been out since 1990, right? However, all these colonial states have taken and are still holding. In Australia, they don't have a national legislation or even like localized ones. What they have done instead is they actually sign confidential contracts with holding institutions, so that way they can like outline what their relationship is going to be and what type of items they were going to repatriate, a timeline, a process, stuff like that. Um, and then they also have it as a confidential aspect because sometimes there are, things that are private that need to stay private, right? And if you notice, I'm trying to use the word private and not secret because private is different than secret. And a lot of times people think, oh, secret societies, and they've got all this woo-woo mysticism and it's secret. And no, that's private. And you might think it's secret because you have to do 20 years of learning to enter the door. And so then that person knows because they spent the time to learn and to do that. Um, could they just tell you? Probably they could just tell you some stuff, but would it be effective or would it be within the context that it's supposed to be used at? I don't think so. So there is that. And uh, Britain has a act, Human Tissues Act, to help return. However, as I said, a Human Tissues Act. It's very specific, and it's not necessarily about returning human remains. Um, or belongings. There are, though, some Scottish museums that have started to repatriate. A lot of times it's getting that foot in the door. There are organizations and stuff like that that have knowledge or relationships with holding institutions in Europe and stuff like that that could help uh, you know, introduce a nation to that holding institution and to learn from the Indigenous nation what to expect. Right? So um, I can't remember exactly which museum it was, but I know that in 2018 I attended a repatriation conference, and one of the European museums said that they had what they thought was a um, Sutina person from like around Calgary. I was all like, because my cousin is a lawyer and works with them. And I was like, hey, by the way, just in case they don't know, this museum has like what they believe to be about 2 to 3 ancestors. Here's the contact information. Give it to the nation because that museum sounds like they are willing to repatriate. They just, for some reason, haven't emailed you guys. So there's that aspect. So, and that again, like all of what I'm saying is about, uh, and it's not going to be an easy road to do this because I believe that each and every single taking is a microcosm and a macrocosm of colonial history. That is not just history yet, because they still have them and they're still making decisions and they're still providing that narrative, which is why, again, like I said, Indigenous nation building for me is helpful for repatriating because it's about what's culturally matched, what type of leadership do we need, right? It's not just elected leaders. We need leaders from all areas and ways. We need the institutions. And that doesn't mean a physical building either. It could be the spiritual and cultural institutions in order to return. We need practical sovereignty. So that idea being like, what can we do and what will we do, right? That's just like the Nike part. And then strategy, right? Um, what's going to take short, medium, long term? And what are your priority now? Is it certain types or is it certain areas, right? Like you want to repatriate everything from Saskatchewan first, right? Those are all decisions that need to be made by the nation.
Can I just throw one other thing
Yeah.
in here? Just when we're talking about like the international nature of this. So like the colonialism didn't just happen here, right? It happened in
Yes.
Africa, it happened in
Mhm.
Asia. So like in Nigeria, for example, there was a kingdom, the kingdom of Benin. There was like a castle there, and the Brits just looted the whole thing. And there were all these bronze statues in there that were arranged in a particular way to tell the history of this kingdom.
Mhm.
And all the statues were, taken. They're in museums in the UK. The British Museum is being a real pain in the arse about actually returning them. Some of the museums in Scotland, as you say, are doing better. But yeah, so Nigeria itself has built a holding facility to bring these things back home, right? Another example is even Greece. A lot of things were looted from Greece, and
Mhm.
the under the time when Greece was under control of the Ottoman Empire, and the Greeks are trying to bring their things back home, like these carvings that were taken off the Parthenon, these 1,000-year-old
The
buildings.
Elgin
And
marble.
yes, exactly. And the Brits are still holding on to them and saying, no, you don't have, the means to keep these safe to the country of Greece. Like this is a massive issue. And I would say I think the British Museum is one of the most difficult in the world to deal with in this regard. In
Mhm.
Saskatchewan, we're a lot easier to sit down and have tea with. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's also, sometimes simpler to just have, you know, have tea about somebody and then you might know how to work with them. Um, but I actually attended a conference back in 2021, I think, or 2022. Um, that was about it was an international conference and it was in Switzerland and it was about um, human remains, right? Like, is it now more of an international norm not to display human remains of anybody unless it's like a scientific thing that somebody's actually signed off on, right? And they're looking at a lot of those aspects. They had example of one person that uh, who had basically been dissected all the way through and stuff like that. And they're like, oh, we had gotten permission, and they're like, oh wait, no, we probably didn't get permission from that actual person because they were a slave, and so therefore, um, permission from the property owner does not mean permission from the person whose actual body it was and is. And then yeah, in Africa, there was a lot of looting as well. And I want to say that there was one where they actually took the head of their king. And then I think they finally gave that back, but they haven't given back anything else, right?
Yeah. Even the crown jewel on the British crown was a diamond stolen from India that India is still asking back for, the Koh-i-Noor diamond.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of, but the thing is like if we don't know where they are or how they're being used, what can we do? And I know that University of Manitoba in 2018, like I'm going to use the word found some indigenous ancestors that were still being utilized for educational purposes. They stopped, and then they started looking around the entire university, and I think the census was about 200 and some Indigenous human remains. And then they worked with like grandmas and grandpas and knowledge keepers and things like that to create a policy for this repatriation and rematriation, right? And it was about a year and a half or so, 2 years that we spent on that, right? And they are repatriating them back. One of them went to Alaska. I know that, like there was like the, indigenous remains from Alaska at University of Manitoba. So you'll never know what's going to be there or not. Um, I've also heard, I also remember one instant where NAGPRA was coming and the university and the people didn't want to deal with it. So they just drywalled the door shut and like just pretended that room didn't exist whatsoever. But, changes in personnel happen, and like 20 years later, someone's like, oh, we're putting this up. What's this? There's an entire room of remains and things. Oh, jeepers. I guess we need to deal with NAG for now, right? So there is that part. Okay, I was like, we're getting close. I think 6 minutes.
Okay, let me just that quickly. So for people looking to learn more about repatriation, what can they do? Or are there any upcoming opportunities for people to join another session or?
Mhm. Well, actually, I'm organizing a repatriation forum or gathering on June 16th at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law and the Indigenous Law Center. So we are hosting that. That is I'm hoping to get the ball rolling for people to start talking about what they want, what they see it as, to share if they've gotten a repatriation or a rematriation, or if it's just been a return, right? Sometimes holding institutions give things on a conditional loan basis, which still means though that there's no legal ownership um, underneath Western law for that nation. And then sometimes some of them holding institutions will say, well, we can't give it back because you don't have the museum and the temperature control and all that stuff. But the nation may not be looking to, house it in a museum-like thing. They may be looking to actually utilize it, or sometimes, um, like with the Zuni, when they put their stuff out on those altars, it's not just you walk by and go, "Oh, free Zuni fetishes. Let me take that home." No, they're actually out there and they're supposed to be destroyed slowly through weather conditions as part of that offerings. So those are like sometimes things have to return back into the earth. Um, but if the nation wishes to not do that, that's something different than the museum holding it and making that decision for them. Okay. And to learn more about repatriation in general, uh, I'm always a big fan of like in the smaller scope of conscious. That was the Dr. McEwen's book. That was published in about 2000 and some, which is the history of why NAGPRA and the NMAI Act is out. I would say Skull Wars is also a really good one to talk about the manifest destiny and the scientific racism that was out there. Uh, Kathleen Dare Fine has another book on repatriation. There are two older books that Catherine Bell helped co-edit on repatriation and cultural practices within Canada. Um, and then the the BC First Peoples Council issued a report relatively recently about the costs of repatriation, which was a study that was undertaken through funds from like the British Columbia, from the province. And then in 2023, USask Law hosted a heritage workshop, and that report is out there. That one's more than just repatriation, but it's out there because as it stands right now, the Saskatchewan Heritage Act, the minister's the one that makes the decisions about who's affiliated and who isn't. And it's so old. We're called Amerindians, and they get to decide whether or not the remains are educational enough, and whether or not they can be returned and to whom. So, and they are not going to change anything on that because there's not enough of a push. They don't think it's a priority area.
So we'll just gather all that list.
Pardon?
Some of the research. I know Thompson shared the cost of repatriation report with me, so I have it somewhere on my computer, and we can gather that and send that out to participants.
Yeah. And then one of the things that I also put out for people, I know it's like, oh my God, this is really old. It's from like 2013 or something. But the Little Traverse Bay Band of Adala Indians actually put together like a little manual on like tribal repatriations, kind of like uh, what what they've encountered, what other nations have encountered, what are some of the questions that you should ask yourself, whether or not you make the same decision or not is entirely up to you, right? Um, but that one I found to be very useful in a practical kind of like, how is my office going to run? So, because I've also heard of ones where, you know, Diane has all the records of all that stuff, but she has it in the back of her car, and now she's ticked off and she just quit, and we can't access those files anymore because nobody bothered to get a filing cabinet to put it in there. Now Diane has it all. And, can somebody find her auntie and see if she can be sweet talked, right? It's just that's just the realities, right? Of sometimes of what is out there. And I feel like sometimes we don't hear those types of realities of holding institutions because they keep it a lot quieter. But I usually just share that there's going to be some unique aspects that may be um, Indigenous specific only because of the way in which the colonial history has like prepped us to have those silos and insufficient capacity and underfunding and forcing of cultural replacements. So does that help, Crystal?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and there's definitely some newer books as well, but those are the ones that I used the most when I was younger and writing a dissertation. So that's why I know those ones the best. But there are definitely some more that if I think about it, I would put it out. And I do know that Dr. McEwen is putting out another article because I peer reviewed it. And then I believe that there was another one that was going to come out. I haven't seen it lately. I peer reviewed that one, but I think that they pulled it. So I think repatriation, rematriation, returns home, those are all aspects to look and to find. And maybe there are other ones out here too that know of some books. I know that there's one boat from the Blackfoot that talk about their journey home and what they've done because they did quite a few of the repatriation and rematriation aspects as well. And then you can see that too over at Satina because they have their like cultural center and they have belongings there that have been returned.
So if anyone is going traveling to Alberta, there is the Blackfoot Crossing on the Siksika First Nation, and they've actually repatriated a lot of items to their center. and they have
Mhm.
some paths and all that. But I thought it was really interesting that they brought ceremony back after they repatriated their ceremonial bundles. And so it goes back to your comment about revitalization. But
Mhm.
oh, I could go now. It's 12 o'clock.
And the reason why the Blackfoot can get those back, right, is because the Royal Alberta Museum and I think it's the Glenbow are part of that legislation that carves out the ability for them to actually do that because the museum can't, deaccession except in very, very specific situations where basically the item's destroyed, right? So they have to keep it in perpetuity for the good of the public. However, it's actually not the public's. So they have to go there and carve it out. And that's why University of Manitoba put together their policy. They needed that policy in order for the university to have the requisite like background and legal footing to um, financially help with the repatriations, to take that responsibility that they did take, and to um, and to allow them to you know, not have them defined as property anymore, so they could actually then repatriate them.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. And I don't know about anybody else, but I've got like 6 pages of little papers here with ideas, and I'm dreaming and scheming up this booklet that we can help create on the wise practices of others. I think that was like such a great name, or a great kind of collection of practices and stories that we can work with people. And yeah, we will probably, well, as soon as we hear, we will share to all the registrants from this session and the last session on that College of Law Repatriation Forum. If it's open to everybody, we'll wait to hear back from you on who's kind of invited or kind of the scope of that project. And then we really want to hear from you guys, what you guys want to learn about, what you guys want to talk about. The kind of team of people we dream and scheme and love meetings, but we really want to be tangible and to be takeaways for your communities and your spaces. So if there's something specific that you want to learn about that we can kind of help connect the dots to bring in these conversations on repatriation, we would love to help keep bringing these special guests on the call, because yeah, each and every one of these, something new comes out, and some new words and terms and books and podcasts that I want to listen to. So yeah, thank you everybody for being a part of the space. And again, please reach out to anybody really on the call, Thomas and Gabe, Crystal, myself, and we can help put you in contact with Jamie as well. So yeah, thank you. We love these thoughts.
And I just wanted to reiterate my thanks to Dr. Lavallee for coming and sharing your perspective. You've worked not just here, you've worked, uh, you have a good bird's eye view of the kind of the scope of the field, and how it's being enacted in here and in different regions. And I'm really grateful you came here to share your knowledge and insights with us. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank you for inviting me. And then maybe one day I'll actually go all the way down there.